In the summer of 2020, during their annual developer conference, Apple announced a new version of macOS with some very interesting changes. There are a lot of features taken straight from iOS, including Control Center, widgets, and most notably, the icons. These new macOS icons mimic the shape and color palette of their iOS counterparts, but if you examine a little closer, there's something strange about the way that they look. They retain the abstract glyphs of iOS, but have depth and shading, which many journalists point out looks a lot like neumorphism. And this subtle shift in design lets Apple bring continuity to their two most important platforms, but also lets them reference the rich visual history of macOS 10. It's a sign that UI design might be heading somewhere new and exciting very soon. This video is part 2 of 2 in a series I'm doing about Apple software design in both iOS and macOS. Today we'll be talking about Jony Ive in the era immediately following Scott Forstall's departure, up until today with the current version of macOS Big Sur. If you haven't seen part 1, I really recommend it. It's in the description. So who takes over iOS and macOS design when Scott Forstall leaves? Well, up until now, the software and hardware of Apple products were designed by separate teams. Forstall got to decide what the software looked like, and Jony Ive, who's SVP of hardware design at the time, decided what the hardware looked like. So when Forstall left, Apple let Ive's hardware team take over software in an effort to promote a more unified design language across the company. You probably recognize Ive, or at least you recognize his voice, because up until recently, he's the guy that's been narrating Apple product videos, and he has an accent so British that even Jobs made fun of him for it.
We worked together for nearly 15 years, and he still laughed at the way I said aluminium.
Jony Ive started working at Apple in 1992 after spending most of his early career working at design consultancies. When Jobs returned to Apple in 1996, one of his first reactions was to outsource design. But after he visited Ive and saw what the Apple Design Labs was capable of, he was thoroughly impressed and made the decision to keep design in-house and let Ive direct it. Jobs and Ive became inseparable friends, and you would often find them having daily lunch at Apple's cafeteria. And reportedly, there was even a hidden corridor directly connecting Jobs' office and Ive's studio at Apple's old headquarters. That way, Jobs could pop in and see what Ive and his team was working on. Jony Ive originally got into industrial design through his love of cars, but to understand how Ive thought about design, we have to analyze his influences. One of the most obvious is German designer Dieter Rams, somebody who Ive adores. Rams was part of the Bauhaus, a school and movement in the design world that started in Germany in 1918 and spanned much of the century. Bauhaus, or HFG Ulm, the spiritual successor to the original Bauhaus school, taught a way of design that aims to strip away anything that didn't have to do with the intended function of the item. This philosophy is sometimes referred to as German functionalism, and it was a reaction to the craft-oriented design of the 1800s that often focused too much on ornamentation than the actual usefulness of a product. Bauhaus is the period of design where you first start to hear the phrases form follows function and less is more, because Bauhaus was extremely principled like that. In 1955, Dieter Rams got to start working for Braun, a German company that at the time made home goods such as kitchen appliances and electronics. He completely transformed design at Braun and became chief design officer in 1961, just 6 years after joining. Rams designed some of Braun's most iconic products in the Bauhaus tradition, including this radio, this calculator, and most notably this record player, the Braun SK4, a product the design community reveres and lovingly refers to as Snow White's coffin. A lot of these Rams designed Braun products have become museum pieces and collector's items over the years. When you put some of the works Dieter Rams and Jony Ive designed side by side, you can really start to see the influence, and sometimes it's almost uncanny. And this has not gone unnoticed by Rams himself, though he has publicly stated that Apple produces some of the best design in the world now.
Und das ist im Moment wieder eine amerikanische Firma. Das ist Apple.
One of Jony Ive's design principles, which becomes obvious when you hear him talk, is honesty to the materials. And this comes from, again, his Bauhaus and functionalist influences. To understand what honest to the material means, I want to show you the headquarters of Big Sur, which is a furniture company founded to produce works designed by Dieter Rams. Their headquarters is constructed top to bottom in unfinished, unpainted wood. And that's intentional, because in their own words, their building was designed like nature without paintbrushes. It celebrates wood as a building material in its most natural form. It's not hidden under a coat of paint or a facade of brick. It's just wood. Now I want you to listen to what Jony Ive had to say about the iPhone 5C, a phone he designed that was released in 2014.
iPhone 5C is beautifully, unapologetically plastic.
I know that sounds silly and pretentious, but what he means is that the phone was not designed to look like it was made of a different material. That when you saw it and when you held it, it looked and felt like it was made of plastic. The phone wasn't trying to hide it. But why is he so proud of that fact? It's plastic, after all, not a premium material like aluminum found on the iPhone 5S. Well, this application of plastic in a phone was in stark contrast to one of Apple's main competitors at the time, Samsung, whose phones were mostly physically made of plastic but were designed to look like they weren't. Samsung phones at the time had stitched leather backs, which were actually just injection molded plastic parts made to look like leather, and brushed metal sides, which were again just plastic painted to look like metal. They formed and textured and did whatever they could to make their plastic phone look like it was made of something else, something way more premium. In other words, Samsung made phones that were apologetically plastic, and Apple didn't. Jony Ive's focus on material honesty extended to all of the products he designed at Apple. They always had integrity. Metal looked and felt like metal, and plastic looked and felt like plastic. Where Ive did explore different applications of a material, he did so in colors and finishes. Modern Apple products that had color were never painted. The color was either mixed into the material, like in a plastic, or applied as an anodization to a metal, which still preserves the outward appearance and feel of the material. Before Jony Ive took over software design at Apple, journalists would ask what he thought about Apple's skeuomorphic software. He never really liked answering the question and often shrugged it off, saying that it wasn't really his domain, but after Forstall left and Ive took over, he said he believed that skeuomorphs had been appropriate when the iPhone first launched because it helped ease people to make the transition from a physical object to doing things on a glass screen. But in 2013, now that Ive was in control and that Apple was 7 generations into their mobile operating system, it was time to get rid of these skeuomorphic training wheels. So what happens when Jony Ive, somebody who is obsessed with material honesty, is tasked with redesigning the entire visual language of Apple software? Well, he gets rid of the texture, he gets rid of the ornamentation, and he gets rid of the skeuomorphs.
True simplicity is derived from so much more than just the absence of clutter and ornamentation. It's about bringing order to complexity.
Software has no natural material. It has no physical properties. It's a blank canvas. It doesn't look like wood, it doesn't look like felt, and it definitely doesn't look like metal. Skeuomorphism felt dishonest and apologetic because it was full of literal references to reality and the past, and the iPhone was supposed to be the future. Once you escaped skeuomorphism, apps no longer had to be tied down to only what exists in the real world. Apps could be anything once you remove that constraint. The Contacts app on the iPad was no longer a notebook and could take up the full height of the iPad's screen. iBooks tore down its solid wood bookshelf. Calendars, reminders, and notes all lost their leather trim. Some of the icons went from being very literal to very abstract, like the Photos and Game Center icons. This design was very formal and oftentimes clinical. The rich textures of iOS 6 were replaced by white screens in order to keep the focus on the user's content instead of the app's window chrome, which is what designers call this stuff. There are a few references to the past though. For example, the Notes app still had a paper-like texture to keep a sense of playfulness. The Calculator app also continued to allude to the Brown ET66, a calculator designed by none other than Dieter Rams. Without the various visual metaphors, apps were allowed to experiment with different layouts and visual hierarchies. The lack of imagery and texture meant text, typography, and color played more important roles in communicating information. Jony Ive also carried this design into OS X, the Mac operating system, and we saw that a year later with the release of version 10.10 Yosemite in 2014. The design language of the desktop operating system was flattened to be more in line with the design goals of iOS 7 and included flatter elements free of gloss and texture, and apps mostly free of skeuomorphs. This is also the first time we see a big change in OS X's icons, with most redrawn for the first time since 2001. But notice how some of the app icons aren't completely flat either, like their iOS counterparts. For the most part, they still take the shape and form of previous OS X icons, looking almost like cartoon caricatures to the previous generation's photorealistic renders. And this look persisted for 6 years, all the way up until macOS Catalina, but in the summer of 2020, macOS Big Sur brought big changes. Icons were redesigned yet again and were redrawn to look a lot more like iOS icons, but instead of the abstract 2D glyphs seen on iOS, Big Sur's icons were rendered with almost photorealistic lighting and shadow. Take a look at the Messages app icon that's currently used in iOS 14 on the iPhone. It is a solid white glyph on a gradient background. Now look at how this icon was adapted for macOS Big Sur. The flat white glyph turns into a real bubble. It's shaded, it has highlights, it has shadow, and pay attention to how the background color is reflected onto the surface of the bubble, and how the bubble itself casts a shadow onto the background. These are all artifacts of how light behaves in real life, and don't necessarily belong in the iOS visual style, which is completely free of this. There's also a chance that this visual language makes its way over to iOS as well. Some third-party developers are adopting neumorphic icons and interfaces in their apps, signaling support for this new design style as a whole. And Apple seems to be heading this direction as well, with App Store Connect being their first iOS app with a neumorphic icon. Even though the icons of macOS have adopted this new visual style, the overall interface has retained a flat look without really any neumorphic treatment, which could mean that Apple isn't serious about adopting neumorphism. But I think they might, or at least I think they should, and let me explain. Apple is getting more and more serious about its AR capabilities, and one of the things you do as a developer writing an AR application is you augment reality with user interfaces. Unlike on your phone screen, reality is where you expect objects to cast shadows or to reflect and receive light. A flat UI, like what currently exists in iOS and macOS, looks a little out of place in reality. Nothing is that perfectly white or that perfectly lit without shade nor shadow in the real world. And this is where the neumorphic style really starts to make sense, because again, they look as if they're rendered in reality with real light sources. Apple could design its user interfaces in AR to respond to real lighting in your environment. But this is all just a theory. Who knows if this is what the designers at Apple are really thinking of doing, but it'll be interesting to see if Apple takes neumorphism further or if this is truly the stopping point. But before I go, what happens to Jony Ive? Apple went to great lengths to keep Jony Ive happy throughout his tenure at Apple. When Ive got promoted to SVP of Design, he worked underneath John Rubinstein, and Ive didn't really get along with Rubinstein on a number of projects in the early days of Jobs' return, and Rubinstein eventually leaves. Whether it's because of this disagreement or because of some other reason, Ive takes over the design decisions that were previously Rubinstein's, giving him enormous operational power. Ive also didn't see eye to eye with Scott Forstall, and Forstall steps down, leaving much of his responsibility to Ive as well. He slowly collected power at Apple until he was Chief Design Officer, a position where nobody could tell him what to do. And then he left. Jony Ive's departure from Apple in 2019 comes as somewhat of a surprise, given how influential he has been in shaping Apple as everybody knows it today. Key reporters have seen this coming for ages though. Jony Ive had become disinterested in product design itself for a while, choosing to explore more prestigious and ambitious design. He started taking commissions for one-off luxury vehicles and high-end cameras that would be sold at auction. The $10,000 first-generation Apple Watch edition was his doing, because he wanted watch to be seen as a fashion item and not a wellness product. He then proceeded to take a break from product design and move on to architecture, leaving Apple with quite literally the biggest thing he has ever designed, the Apple Park campus. Neumorphism, like flat design before it, comes swiftly and somewhat suspiciously after the departure of key design leadership. Just like how iOS 7 debuted soon after Scott Forstall's departure, neumorphism was brought to macOS right after Jony Ive left Apple. But this is not to say Apple will be completely lost without him. The design team that Jony Ive built at Apple is one of the most closely knit and internationally awarded teams that exists in the design world. In the first 15 years, only 2 people have ever left this team, and one was due to health concerns. Just like how Apple has done fine after the passing of Jobs, I think Apple will continue to do fine without the leadership of Ive. Jony Ive going forward will continue to work with Apple in the role of a design consultancy with his friend and former Apple co-worker Mark Newson. If anything, Ive is returning to his roots, as this role closely resembles how Ive worked before he joined Apple. Looking back, Jony Ive's role in making some of the most iconic and culturally significant computing products of the 21st century will cement his legacy as one of the most influential designers in history. Your phone or computer, regardless if it was made by Apple, has been shaped by the trends he had a hand in creating, and he's not done yet. It's going to be interesting to see how Apple continues to evolve without him.